Okay, there's a wonderful little line that's floating around that the British extracted $45 trillion worth of resources from India in 1990 dollars. And this was said to have occurred from 1765 to 1938 in a paper published in a Columbia journal. And this is wonderful. I'm so glad the Impressionists picked this comically impossible figure. If they picked a lower number, then it would be harder to argue against, because let's say they said that the British stole $500 billion worth of stuff. As we'll later see, that might be physically possible. Now, not practically possible, because they would starve so many of the Indian population. There'd be no way for the population to grow if they took $500 billion over that period. But it would at least be like it would be within the realm of physical reality. Because we have to ask, how much stuff was in the Indian economy from 1765 to 1938? Well, the population in 1750 was around 183 million. The population in 1800 was around 190 million. So to estimate the population in 1765, you have to multiply the two, but you have to just do a linear regression, but then time. You know what? Fuck it. The population of India in 1941, 3 years after the end date of Utsa Patnaik's so-called analysis here, was 389 million. So you know what? Let's just say India had 389 million people for all 173 years of Patnaik's analysis. Let's say they had 389 million people in 1765 all the way up to 1938. The per capita GDP, of course, was anywhere from $682 to $526 per person, and so we have to do it every single year, and we have to weight by population every single. You know what? Fuck it. Let's give them $700 per person, right? Let's just, that's higher than any number, any value on this table, but let's just $700 per person, 389 million people a year. And let's say that the British were in charge of the whole continent in all of those years, that there was no transition period, that on the year 1765, they were in charge of the whole thing, from Burma to the borders of Afghanistan. These are wildly high numbers, but even using these ridiculous numbers, you get India having an economy of 272.3 billion each year. Multiply this by 173, and the economic production of India using these ridiculous overestimates of their economy would have been 47.11 trillion. So the British took 45 trillion, or 95.7% of the Indian economy, leaving the Indians to manage with the remaining 4.3% of what they produced. This is a joke. And if we were to use more realistic numbers, realistic assumptions about the population and about the size of the Indian economy over these years, it becomes apparent that India did not have $45 trillion worth of stuff to loot. It was probably something more like 30 trillion, but I'm not even gonna bother to do the work because because even using ridiculous numbers, this is impossible. But then I get a problem when I do this, because you have people who will imagine that, okay, maybe it wasn't 45 trillion, maybe it was just 1 trillion that was looted, or maybe it was only 500 billion that was looted. And so this is the ratchet effect, right? They throw out a ridiculous number, 45 trillion, and then when that's pointed out to be literally physically impossible, they then go, oh, well, then they sort of bargain down to a lower number that now suddenly seems more reasonable when it's contrasted with 45 trillion. 1 trillion looted from India, okay, that sounds reasonable now that you just said 45 trillion. But the reality is there's no more basis for that 1 trillion number than there was for the 45 trillion number. It just seems reasonable by comparison. It's a psychological trick. But the reality is that the British Empire as a whole didn't appear to confer any at least noticeable economic benefit to Britain. And something I did some time ago was what I called the colonization index, showing how many colonial subjects a European empire had relative to its home population, and then comparing that to its later economic success in 1970 and in 2013. And since I was dealing with colonialism as a whole, this has later years because I'm talking a lot about Africa and the decolonization of Indonesia. And so I needed to use a later year when it was sort of all wrapped up. India went sort of early in 1948. And what this shows is that countries with big empires in 1940 were no better off than European countries without empires by 1970. In fact, they're a little bit worse off. They're a little bit low in the stack here. And if we compare the United Kingdom to its neighbors in Europe, we see that from 1820 to 1913, the height of the British Empire, was also precisely the time frame in which Britain began falling back into the rest of the pack of Western Europe. Not behind Western Europe, but sort of falling back into the ranks of Western Europe. It was no longer exceptional. So if Britain is getting trillions and trillions of loot from India, well, it doesn't appear to be doing them a whole lot of good. In fact, after 1948, when India was released, the growth of the British economy accelerated. And that should give you pause, because wait a minute, if the British economy was built on the back of India and all the loot they were getting from India, shouldn't the British economy have faced a severe downturn following India's independence? And yet, just the opposite. It's as if a ball and chain had been released from Britain. Ooh, ain't that a deep cut? In fact, I could use this data to say something that many, many people throughout history have said. Empire is folly, and that the British Empire was far from being some great benefit to Britain, but was in fact a financial drain. I mean, you certainly don't look at this little graph here and go, oh, Britain really benefited from controlling India. That's not the narrative that pops out at you. As Britain is securing control over India, they're starting to economically fall back into the pack of Western Europe. One of the claims that some great wealth was looted from India is based on a belief that India was as wealthy as England on a per capita basis before, Europeans ravaged the continent. Now, the main problem with this idea is that in the 1500s, Portugal, okay, forget Britain. I mean, Portugal, like this little country, was able to not conquer India, fair enough, but they were able to win a few military victories and establish coastal strongholds. And this was in the 1500s, long before the Industrial Revolution and the Great Divergence, where Europe really shot past the rest of the world economically. Now, I know money and wealth doesn't 100% translate into military proficiency, but the fact that Portugal, while having to sail halfway around the world, could kind of bust up and push around a country with probably something around 20 times the population, despite the logistical disadvantages that Portugal had in sailing halfway around the world to do this, and to do so for hundreds of years, makes the idea that the Mughals, just weren't interested in military proficiency seem like a retarded explanation for that. Oh, the Mughals allowed the Portuguese to have these coastal forts and strongholds because the Mughals just didn't care about it, or they didn't care about losing battles to the Portuguese. Come on. Now, for Tharoor, this isn't some neutral academic exercise. His career is centered around playing to the Indian oppression narrative. If he were to recognize that his basic narrative was false, that would be to admit his life's work was based on a lie. So under no circumstances can he ever admit this or ever concede his core narrative on this. And this isn't some banal falsehood. This is the bread and butter of ultranationalist narratives that lead to future atrocities. It is hate speech in the truest sense, and it is the first step on a road to something very bad. Classic example of this, of course, is Hitler claiming falsely that Germany was put upon by the Versailles Treaty, or the Japanese claiming falsely that the Western powers were colluding to prevent them from having an empire like Britain did. Of course, the Japanese weren't aware of the fact that these empires didn't actually make Britain or France wealthy, but they considered it oppression that they, as Japan, was denied having an empire of a similar scale of Britain. Or in South Africa, how the Zulus twisted the desire of the whites wanting to live in their own white-only spaces, just like every ethnic group wants to have, and whites wanting to live this way in land in which whites occupied before the Zulus actually migrated from the north. They twisted this into some mythology that they, the Zulus, were actually being oppressed by the whites, which they then use to this day to justify laws prohibiting whites from owning businesses or simply stealing farms from white families, and these land reform policies which have destroyed other countries such as Zimbabwe. All of this is justified with the myth of oppression, and it really couldn't be otherwise. In order to carry out a horrible act against another group of people, you must internalize that they did something horrible to you. That's the only way that most people, or at least the great mass of people, can actually justify it to themselves. Sir, some sociopaths and psychopaths and criminals can engage in heinous acts just because, but for most people, they need a cause. They need a myth of rape to justify the revenge. Rape and revenge. These oppression narratives, they're not liberal, they're not enlightened, and they're at least as old as the Old Testament, when the Hebrews falsely portrayed themselves as being oppressed by the pharaohs, which was then used to justify sacking towns in northern Egypt on their way to the Levant. And of course, the Pharaoh then sent an army to pursue the Hebrews after getting word that the Hebrews were sacking towns in northern Egypt for supplies. In turnabout, the Palestinians today use a bogus narrative to justify their attacks on the Israelis. The myth that their land was stolen by the Israelis, when I don't want to go into that here, but it really wasn't. And of course, throughout Europe, there are numerous examples of this. The Poles, for example, seizing land from Germany and from Germans and Russian minorities, as the Germans and Russians had supposedly prior been oppressing Poland, even though Poland owed its very existence to Germany as a result of Germany creating the Kingdom of Poland during World War I. And of course, the Balkans are full a whole bunch of small rape and revenge narratives too numerous to count. So when so-called liberals and so-called leftists feed into these lies about European colonial oppression, what you're doing is you're providing cover and legitimacy for ultranationalist movements, not the kind of healthy group identification sort of thing, but a real sort of rape and revenge, we deserve reparations. That's what reparations is. It's the rape and revenge narrative. It's nationalism, and it's an aggressive form of ultranationalism that is only ever powered by a myth of rape. Now, I'm doing the opposite. I'm trying to diffuse these conflicts. And in order to diffuse these conflicts, I'm trying to say, no, you weren't raped. That's what you have to do. In order to diffuse the cause of ultranationalist atrocious wars, you have to debunk the myth of rape. But when I do this, we're then left with a very uncomfortable question for the Indians in this instance, which is they ask, well, if you didn't rape me, why am I poor? And that is the psychological bind. Well, you're poor because of choices made by you. And the effects of the European empires were anything from neutral to slightly positive. And that's a very hard pill to swallow. So they'll cling to these anecdotes. They'll cling to some simplistic interpretation of the Bengal famine. They'll blow into puritanical proportion this or that massacre of a rebellion. It's a very hard pill to swallow to tell the Indians that they are and always were the ones most responsible for their own situation, that they are the chief culprit. It is much easier psychologically to find a scapegoat, and who other than the British themselves to serve the role as this scapegoat. They're certainly a very salient entity in Indian history. They're somewhat foreign. They are perfect. They're perfectly positioned to serve the role as the scapegoat. And when you step back for a second, what other than this could Tharoor possibly be doing? We know that rape and revenge narratives and scapegoats are ubiquitous throughout history. We know that Tharoor gets basic facts about industrial and education policy wrong in his little smear screeds. He's an Indian nationalist, and the British are his scapegoat in the Indian rape and revenge narrative. They serve the exact same function as Jews did in European history. Blame all of your problems on Jews in rape and revenge narratives because they were market-dominant minorities that made you pay your rent. You weren't oppressed. You tried to conquer as much as you could whenever you could. Everyone on the planet did. The Europeans were just better at it. And in an unprecedented decision, these Europeans voluntarily gave up their empires. You never defeated the British militarily. Unlike the United States, you didn't have to fight a war to achieve your independence. They gave it to you almost for free, and in turn, you cursed them. How petulant. European rule led to a period of unprecedented economic and population growth and a rise in literacy to what it had never seen before. But you were mad because India wasn't doing as well as England itself, as though England owed you what? Parity with itself? And so you cooked up these myths that England oppressed you, and now there's this dangerous far-right ultra-nationalist rape and revenge narrative that people like Tharoor are pushing, and it remains to be seen how it will play out. But let's be clear, however glib and charming people like Tharoor are, what he says is far-right hate speech, and it is not only factually wrong, but morally wrong. And it is a result of envy, wrath, and racism.
India American Professor. Jai Hind, and God bless America.